What would you do if you rode 3,000 miles home, only to find your father murdered and strangers living on the land that carried your family's name? Most men would turn back. Some would run. But when Elias Mercer reached the gates of Iron Creek Ranch in the summer of 1883, he discovered a truth far darker than the distance he'd traveled, and an enemy far more dangerous than the miles behind him. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. If you're ready for a story of blood legacy and the kind of justice a man must take for himself, then settle in. Let me tell you what happened on Iron Creek. He had been on the trail for so long that the world behind him no longer felt real. Only the road ahead, the wind, and the steady rhythm of Claymore's hooves remained. Elias Mercer Eli, to those who once knew him, rode through the red deserts of New Mexico, crossed the frozen passes of Colorado, and pushed north into the relentless winds of the Montana Territory. 3,000 miles. 3,000 miles returned him to the one place he thought he'd never see again. In the pocket of his coat, wrapped in oilskin and worn soft by time, was his father's letter. The ink had nearly faded, but the 4 last words were still clear enough to cut him every time he opened the paper. "Come home, Eli." He must have read it 100 times along the way. Some days the words warmed him. Other days they hollowed him out. But no matter how many times his fingers traced the letters, the truth gnawed at him. The letter had arrived 8 years too late. He remembered the last night he'd stood on Iron Creek soil. The argument had been like fire-hot, bright, destructive. His father had accused him of throwing away the family's future. Eli had accused his father of chaining him to the past. Pride did the rest. He'd ridden off before the sun rose, leaving Samuel Mercer standing alone in the yard with no goodbye. 8 years. 8 years to come back. 8 years to say the words he'd never said. As he rode, guilt traveled with him like another shadow. Every mile stretched it tighter until it felt like a noose around his ribs. The landscape itself seemed to judge him. Dust storms clawed at him in the desert. Snowstorms punched him sideways in the Rockies. North winds sliced through his coat as if punishing him for staying away so long. But he kept going 1 mile after another, clinging to the letter, clinging to the sliver of hope that there was still time. By the time he reached the southern edge of Red Hollow, his face was raw from wind, and Claymore's sides were matted with sweat and dust. The sun was sinking behind the Absaroka Range, painting the sky the same deep rust red that clung to his boots. This was Montana, but not the Montana he remembered. Red Hollow didn't greet him with the familiar quiet of a ranching town. Instead, it buzzed like a hive. Storefronts he remembered as old and crooked now stood straight and freshly painted. New saloons had sprung up on both sides of Main Street, their windows glowing with lamplight and noisy with laughter. And the railroad. The railroad was everywhere. Tall wooden posts lined the valley floor like a spine stretching toward the horizon. The clang of metal and the thudding strike of hammers echoed across the town. Wagons loaded with rails and tools crowded the road. Men in soot-covered coats shouted orders. The smell of hot pitch and iron filled the air. Eli pulled Claymore to a stop outside the livery and scanned the streets. Red Hollow had once been a quiet, rugged settlement. Now it looked hungry, like it was ready to swallow anything that crossed its path. People hurried between shops and saloons, talking in low, excited tones. Land's up 40% already, Crows buying everything north of the ridge. Heard the railroad will pay triple for the creek runs once they secure the rights. No point raising cattle when you can sell dirt for gold. Eli felt his stomach twist. The wild, quiet valley he grew up in was gone, replaced by men with ledgers and hammers who looked at the land and saw numbers instead of roots. He dismounted and walked Claymore toward the blacksmith, hoping for a familiar face. The old forge smelled the same burnt coal, hot iron, and sweat. But the blacksmith who stepped out was a man Eli had never met. "Afternoon," Eli said, pulling his hat brim up. "Looking for Samuel Mercer." The man's hammer froze in midair. He swallowed wiped soot from his brow and stepped closer. "Son." His voice lowered heavy with something Eli didn't want to hear. "Your pa's gone. Buried 3 days now." The world rocked under Eli's boots. He didn't breathe? Couldn't. The blacksmith hesitated, then added softly, "I'm sorry for your loss." Before Eli could speak, another voice cut through the air. "Mercer." Sheriff Nathaniel Briggs approached, coat flapping behind him, a look of wary sympathy on his face. "Eli," he said, nodding once. "I figured you'd be riding in soon." "Word travels fast. What happened?" Eli forced out. "How did he die?" Briggs let out a slow breath. "Official report says a land dispute turned violent. Your father was shot during the altercation." Dispute with who? Eli asked, though the name already crouched in the back of his mind like a wolf waiting to leap. "Harlan Crow," the sheriff said. "He claims self-defense. No clear witnesses. Law can't do much without proof." Eli's jaw clenched until his teeth ached. He gripped Claymore's reins hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "This valley's not the same," Eli Briggs said quietly. "Men like Crow have money connections, railroad men behind them. You be careful where you step." But Eli was no longer listening. His blood was roaring. His father was dead, shot, buried without him. And the man responsible still walked free. Without another word, Eli swung into the saddle and kicked Claymore into a hard gallop. The ranch rose in the distance like a memory he wasn't ready to face, perched on a gentle slope overlooking the Valley Iron Creek Ranch, home of the Mercers for 3 generations. But as he got closer, the familiarity broke apart. The big cottonwood tree his father used to sit under had been hacked halfway down its trunk, raw and pale. The fences were painted in colors the Mercers had never used. The barn doors had been replaced. Even the way the windows were shuttered felt wrong. And then he saw it. The front porch beam where the carved sign Mercer had hung all his childhood now held nothing but 2 empty nail holes. The sign was gone. His name, his family's name, stripped away. Worse still, a deep red flag with a black C stitched in the center hung proudly over the cabin door. Harlan Crow's mark. Crow had claimed Iron Creek. Before he could dismount, a man in a dust coat stepped out of the cabin, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "This land changed hands," the man said. "Crow owns it now. If you know what's good for you, you'll turn that horse around and ride far." Eli stared at the porch, seeing ghosts of his childhood on those boards. His father's boots, his mother's washing tub, Jonah repairing tack, himself small and barefoot running through the dust. All gone. Before fury could make him act, a familiar voice called from the barn. Eli Jonah Pike, older, thinner, leaning heavily on the stalled door, stepped into the light. His hair was thinner, his face more worn, but his eyes still held the same steadiness they had when Eli was a boy. Eli tied Claymore and strode toward him. "What happened, Jonah?" Eli asked, voice cracking against his will. Jonah swallowed hard. "Been praying you'd come back, son. Didn't know if you ever would." "Tell me," Eli said. Jonah's shoulders sagged under the weight of memory. "Harlan Crow came up the valley a month ago. Tried to buy the ranch. Your pa told him what he's told every man who tried before him. Mercer land stays Mercer land." Crow didn't like that answer. Jonah glanced toward the porch, making sure the guard didn't hear. He brought papers, contracts, claims, said your pa had debt he didn't have, said signing over the creek would clear it. Samuel refused. What happened then? Eli asked, throat tight. Jonah's eyes hardened. Crow pulled a gun. Your pa pulled his. Shots were fired. Crow says he shot in self-defense, but I've seen a man lie before. This was one of those times. Eli's breathing turned slow and dangerous. Your pa died fightin' for this place, Jonah whispered. Fell right by the cottonwood. The image carved itself into Eli's mind with brutal clarity. He walked away without a word, heading toward the back hill where his family's graves lay. Jonah didn't follow. Some moments a man must take alone. The path to the ridge was familiar despite the years. At the top stood 3 simple wooden markers, weather-beaten and tilted slightly from the wind. One for Eli's mother, one for his younger sister gone too soon, and now a third. A rough plank of pine with a name carved hurriedly, Samuel Mercer. Eli knelt and pressed his hand to the cold earth. I'm here, he whispered, though the wind swallowed the words. He felt foolish speaking to dirt, felt ashamed he hadn't been there to speak to the man before he became dirt. He stayed until the sky dimmed to purple. Only when the air grew cold did he stand again. Sheriff Briggs was waiting at the bottom of the hill. You shouldn't linger up there alone, Briggs said. Not with Crow's men roam. What aren't you telling me? Sheriff Eli cut in. Briggs sighed. Crow's got money, influence. Railroad men wrapped around his finger. Whatever happened between him and your father? The law won't touch him unless someone brings real proof. I'll find it, Eli said. Briggs shook his head. Eli, listen to me. This valley isn't the one you left. Crows changed the rules. Don't end up like your pa. For a long moment, the 2 men faced each other in the dying light, law against determination, warning against promise. Eli said nothing. He didn't have to. Briggs saw the decision already written across his face. When the sheriff rode away, Eli climbed back to the ridge one last time. From there, the entire sweep of Iron Creek stretched before him. The white-capped stream, the rolling pastures, the barns and cabins and fields his family had built with their hands. It all stirred in him like something waking from a long sleep. He clenched his fists at his sides. I'm done running, he breathed, voice steady as steel. Mercer land stays Mercer land. Night fell over Iron Creek. But for the first time in 8 years, Elias Mercer did not feel lost. He felt home and ready for war. What will Eli do to reclaim his family's land and avenge his father's death when the man who stole everything still holds all the power? I've got a feeling his next move won't just shake the valley. It might burn it to the ground. Hit that subscribe button before we dive into the best part of the story. Eli returned to the main cabin of Iron Creek the next morning, hoping against reason that something might have changed overnight. Maybe Crow's men had left. Maybe he could walk through his father's door again and feel the warmth of home. But reality met him cold and blunt. A guard stepped off the porch, one hand resting lazily on his revolver, as if daring Eli to argue. You step 1 foot inside, the guard said, you trespass. Eli kept his voice steady. This is my father's house, was the man replied. Not anymore. The words hit harder than the threat. With no weapon drawn and no proof yet on his side, Eli turned away. The humiliation stuck to him like dust. He walked to the old horse barn, half rotting, half familiar, and pushed open the creaking door. It smelled of hay, leather, sweat, dust, and the faint sweetness of old pine. His father's handiwork lingered everywhere. Patched beams, hand-carved pegs, grooves worn into the floor, where Samuel Mercer had paced through decades of winters. Eli cleared a space in the corner, spreading a blanket over the hard-packed dirt. When he finally lay down the wood above him, groaning softly as wind pushed against the barn walls, a wave of loss swept over him. "This used to be home," he whispered into the darkness. He closed his eyes and repeated the words he'd repeated all along the trail. "If my pa survived 8 Montana winters, I can survive this one night." But the truth was harder. He wasn't surviving the night, he was surviving what had become of his father's legacy. The next afternoon, Jonah led him to the secondary barn, where Samuel kept financial records, calving logs, breeding notes, and grazing maps. Dust floated through the air in soft spirals as Eli opened the ledger books. Under the warm glow of a kerosene lamp, he read line by line. 10 years of tidy handwriting filled the pages. Income from cattle sales, feed expenses, calving seasons, weather notes, repairs, monthly balances. Everything made sense, everything except the debt. Samuel owed so little. A few dozen dollars manageable, nothing close to the figure Crow claimed when he seized the ranch. Eli frowned. Crow said the land was taken because of debt. But this, he flipped the pages. This doesn't match anything he told the sheriff. Jonah crossed his arms. Samuel never needed loans. He never took them. He always said, "A Mercer stands on his own feet." Eli's suspicion sharpened. If the ranch wasn't foreclosed, then Crow's claim had no foundation. "Something's wrong," Eli said. "Very wrong." He began marking inconsistencies, numbers rewritten in different handwriting in the newer pages. Someone had tampered with the books. But Samuel's earlier entries were clean, consistent, honest. The later pages told a story Samuel had never lived. Someone had built a lie on top of the truth. Jonah returned the next morning carrying a folded paper wrapped in cloth. "Found this in town," he muttered. Copy of the contract Crow filed at the courthouse. Eli spread the document across a table beside Samuel's daily journal. The familiar signature Samuel Mercer appeared dozens of times in the journal. Strong loops. A long sweeping tail on the S, confident strokes. But on Crow's contract, the S stuttered. The loops collapsed. The lines looked forced, clumsy. "Not even close," Eli muttered. He lifted the page closer to the lamp, letting the flame highlight the unease weighing in his chest. "My father didn't sign this," he said quietly. "Not with that hand." Jonah nodded. "I told you. Crow lies like it's a second language." The room felt smaller, tighter. With each passing minute, the rope around Eli's heart pulled tighter. Crow hadn't just stolen the ranch. He'd rewritten the truth to justify it. Later that week, Clara Whitmore found Eli wandering along Main Street. She was carrying a sack of flour, her auburn hair tied back, eyes sharp and full of concern. "You look like a man who hasn't eaten since the war," she said. "Come to the inn. Dinner's on me." At Whitmore Inn, she poured him a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "I heard about the land," she said. "Crow's been bragging in the saloon. Said the valley will be his before winter." Eli's jaw tightened. "And he's been talking to railroad men," Clara added. "Says he'll sell the whole stretch once he clears the remaining obstacles." Eli didn't have to ask who the obstacles were. Clara lowered her voice. "Your father didn't lose that ranch, Eli. Someone took it." Her words settled into him like a weight and a promise. Someone took it, and someone had to take it back. 2 mornings later, a black carriage rolled up Iron Creek's dirt road, stopping at the porch as if it already belonged there. Harlan Crow stepped out dressed in charcoal wool gold chain, glinting across his vest, the smile of a man who believed he owned everything his eyes touched. He walked toward Eli with casual arrogance. Rough living conditions for a Mercer, Crow said, glancing at the barn behind them. Shame you weren't here to manage things. Eli said nothing. Crow gestured wide. I'm willing to make you an offer, son. Sell me whatever you think has left your name, your pride, your illusions. I'm generous today. No, Eli said. Crow stepped closer, voice dropping to a quiet, poisonous tone. Your father stood where you stand now, he murmured. You might want to choose differently. Eli didn't flinch. Crow waited, then smirked an expression that said he believed he already owned the valley. But when he turned away, Eli saw something else in the man's posture. Fear. Crow wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to control a threat. And Eli had just confirmed he was one. That afternoon, Jonah brought Eli out to the pasture. You know how to ride, Jonah said, handing him a lariat. But running a ranch ain't the same. For days they worked side by side. Jonah taught him how Samuel rotated the cattle by seasons, how he checked the creek water for signs of contamination from upstream mining, how he counted calves and separated the healthy from the weak. Eli felt the land again, its pulse, its expectation, its weight. One morning, while they repaired a fence line, Jonah leaned on a post and looked at Eli with soft eyes. Your pa would have been proud, Eli. Real proud. The word struck deeper than Jonah intended. For the first time, Eli felt the ranch's meaning settle into his bones, not as a claim, not as a memory, but as a responsibility. Iron Creek wasn't something you inherited. It was something you earned. A week later, Eli checked the old cabin, Samuel's first home on the property. Most of it had collapsed or weathered away, but the foundation remained. He stepped inside the dim, dusty room. Something felt off. A board near the hearth sat slightly raised. He knelt and pried it loose. Beneath it lay a small wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. His pulse tripped. Inside the box he found a deed, unsigned, untouched, and a letter in Samuel's handwriting, unfinished edges torn. Eli, if you come home, you must. The sentence ended abruptly, ripped off, as though someone hadn't wanted the rest found. Eli closed his eyes, gripping the letter. Now I know, he whispered. His father had refused to sign anything. He had prepared a message. Crow had stopped him before he could finish it. Eli rode into town and entered the sheriff's office with the documents in hand. Briggs studied them long and hard before shaking his head. There's no denying the signatures don't match, the sheriff said. But falsifying a contract and proving Crow meant to kill your pa, that's a different fight. He killed him, Eli said, and he'll do worse if someone doesn't stop him. Briggs sighed, rubbing his temples. Eli, I don't disagree. But Crow's tied in with railroad finance. He's got judges and bankers in his pocket. If you push too hard without solid proof. He paused, meeting Eli's eyes with something like guilt. You might disappear the same way your father did. Eli didn't blame the man. Briggs wasn't corrupt, just trapped like everyone else Crow towered over. But Eli wasn't trapped. He was rising. The trap was set by accident at first, then deliberately. One late afternoon, as Eli and Jonah worked near the cattle pens, the thunder of hooves shook the earth. 3 riders galloped up, guns drawn. At their head was Cole Maddox, Crow's most ruthless enforcer, a man known for killing without hesitation. Maddox didn't slow. He drew fired, and the bullet ripped straight through the wooden sign that once read Mercer, shattering it into splinters. The cattle panicked and scattered across the field. Eli didn't move. Maddox grinned. You got a week, Mercer. After that, we ain't talking anymore. Jonah's hand slid toward his pistol, but Eli stopped him with a look. This wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. The following night, darkness settled over Red Hollow, like a heavy blanket thick with whispers, and the kind of tension that gathers before a storm. In the lamplight of the Red Hollow saloon, Clara Whitmore stepped through the doorway with measured calm. She'd never been one to seek attention, but tonight she needed an audience. The saloon was full card players hunched over tables, ranch hands loud with whiskey land speculators bragging about their next fortune. Clara moved through them quietly, stopping near the bar. She leaned in toward the dealer and spoke just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Eli Mercer's riding to town at sunrise," she murmured, setting a glass down. "Bringing proof Crow forged the papers." The room didn't freeze, but it shifted subtle electric. A few men exchanged glances, others leaned in. The words began to scatter like dry leaves on a gust. "Mercer's got proof. There's evidence Crow faked the deed. He's bringing it to the sheriff tomorrow." In the corner, a man wearing Crow's colors stood abruptly and left without paying his tab. Clara watched him go, her expression neutral, but her pulse steady and sure. Good. Crow would hear by midnight, and once he heard, he would come. Back at Iron Creek, the barn smelled of dust oil and impending violence. Eli Jonah Pike and Thomas Hale stood under the rafters making preparations that would decide whether the ranch lived or died by sunrise. Jonah checked the loading mechanism on his Spencer rifle, wiping the barrel with practiced efficiency. Thomas sat on an overturned crate, breaking down his Winchester, cleaning it with a rag, before snapping it back together with a metallic click. Eli laid out 2 Colt pistols, his father's. The weight of them brought a steadiness to his hands, the same steadiness he had felt as a boy when Samuel Mercer had taught him how to aim. "We'll split positions," Eli said, placing the Colts into their holsters. "Jonah, you take the back of the cattle barn. Maddox will likely come from the ridge, so you'll have a shot at anyone flanking us." Jonah nodded. "I'll be ready." "Thomas, you hold the well," Eli continued. "If Crow's men try circling behind the house, they'll hit your fire first." Thomas tightened the band around his injured arm from a previous scrape and nodded. "They won't get past me." "And me?" Jonah asked. Eli exhaled slowly. "I'll be in the yard, waiting for Crow." Thomas shook his head. "Crow won't come alone. Maddox will start the shooting." "I know." None of them trembled. None hesitated. Fear had burned off them long ago, replaced by something sharper resolve forged from truth and suffering. Sheriff Briggs found Eli later that night beneath the shadow of the pines that bordered the ranch. The sheriff dismounted quietly, his boots crunching on needles as he approached. "You're setting a trap," Briggs said. "And you know damn well Crow's dangerous cornered." "He's dangerous free," Eli replied. Briggs looked toward Iron Creek, toward the ghost of Samuel Mercer lingering in every shadow. "I can't stand with you openly. Not unless I hear him confess. If I don't, the law ties my hands." Eli understood. "I'm not asking you to stop the bullets." Briggs's eyes hardened. "I can't protect you before the bullets fly. Only after I hear the truth." "Then stay close," Eli said. The sheriff nodded once. "Closer than you think." He rode off, and Eli returned to the ranch with the weight of what tomorrow would bring pressing into his spine. There was no turning back. The next day arrived with the kind of stillness that precedes calamity. By noon, the wind had died entirely. Even the cattle seemed uneasy, stomping and snorting, as if sensing the coming violence. Then Eli heard it. Hoofbeats, many. The rumble grew louder, until 4 riders appeared at the bend, Crow's hired guns fanning out across the yard with calculated menace. Behind them rode Cole Maddox, on his black stallion eyes, narrow slits under the brim of his hat. And at last came a polished black carriage, its wheels throwing dust into the air. Harlan Crow stepped out as if arriving to inspect a piece of property he already owned. He removed his gloves slowly, surveying the ranch with a faint smile. "Heard you've got something to show me," Mercer Crow called, voice smooth and mocking. Eli stood in the center of the yard, hands away from his guns, staring directly back at the man who killed his father. Behind Crow, a handful of townsfolk had followed the procession, curiosity outweighing caution. Clara slipped quietly among them, positioning herself behind the well, where she had a clear view of Eli. The air tightened. Crow raised his voice, ensuring everyone heard him. "This ranch is mine by law," he declared. Your father agreed. Eli didn't move. "My father never signed anything, and you know it." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Jonah, hidden behind the cattle barn, steadied his rifle. Thomas crouched near the well, cocked his shotgun quietly. Crow chuckled. "Accusations without witnesses are just air, Mercer." Eli reached into his coat, pulled out the unsigned deed Samuel had hidden away, and threw it at Crow's feet. The paper skidded across the dirt. "That's the original contract," Eli said. "Never signed, never transferred." Crow didn't even look at it. Paper means nothing without a witness. Eli swept an arm toward the people gathered around the yard. "Here's the witness, everyone who hears you today." Maddox's hand drifted toward his revolver. Jonah saw it, Thomas saw it, Eli saw it, and Crow saw that they saw it. The ground seemed to hold its breath. One of the onlookers whispered, "If he didn't sign it, how'd Crow get the deed?" The Crow's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked to Maddox, and then to the barn, then back to Eli. Something cracked inside his carefully crafted arrogance. "You don't know a damn thing, Mercer," he snapped. Eli took a step closer. "I know you forged my father's signature. I know you killed him when he refused. And I know you came here today to silence the truth." Crow's face twisted. "Your father was stubborn," he spat. "He'd sign or he'd die either way." Every soul in the yard froze. Even the wind recoiled. Sheriff Briggs, hidden among the crowd, straightened sharply. His hand closed around his holster. Crow realized too late what he had said. His eyes darted toward Maddox. Maddox. The gunshot came first. Maddox drew with inhuman speed, firing directly at Eli. The bullet tore a plume of dust from the ground, inches from Eli's ribs. Eli dove left, rolling behind a trough as splinters burst from the wood. Jonah fired simultaneously from behind the barn, sending Maddox's men scrambling. One of them spun backward, gripping a bloodied shoulder. The yard exploded into chaos. Gunfire roared like thunder. Horses screamed. Smoke swallowed the sky. Eli sprang to his feet, dodging a second shot from Maddox. Behind him, Thomas took a bullet through the arm, but stayed upright, firing steady shots that kept Crow's men from advancing past the well. Jonah's rifle cracked again and again with deadly precision. The battle raged across the Mercer yard, the same soil Samuel had died defending. Through the haze, Maddox stepped out, gun-drawn eyes, burning with the sick thrill of a killer. He pointed at Eli. "Your father begged," Maddox sneered over the gunfire. "Will you?" Eli lifted his Colt. His heart didn't pound. His hands didn't shake. Samuel Mercer's training ran deeper than fear. The two men circled each other slowly, boots cutting grooves in the dust. They were wolves, calculating lethal, waiting for the smallest mistake. A shot cracked. Dirt erupted between them. Another shot, another miss. The distance closed as they advanced, and fired, each bullet carving death into the air around them. The final steps brought them so close, they could see the reflection of their own rage in each other's eyes. But Crow, desperate and hunted by his own confession, changed the game entirely. He lunged toward the well, grabbing Clara by the arm. Before she could scream, he yanked her against him and jammed his revolver against her temple. "Nobody moves," Crow shouted. "I want a horse now." Gunfire staggered, then fell silent. Clara trembled, but her eyes met Eli's with fierce defiance. "Let me go," Crow snarled, "or she dies." Jonah tried to find an angle for a clear shot, but Eli lifted his hand sharply. "No," Eli whispered. "The angle's wrong." Crow backed toward his carriage, dragging Clara with him. "You hear me, Mercer?" he screamed. "You lose everything today, just like your old man." A groan cut through the air. Maddox, bleeding heavily, had managed to rise to one knee. His hand fumbled for his revolver, lifting it toward Eli with a shaking arm. Eli saw the motion out of the corner of his eye. In one fluid movement, he spun, drew, and fired. The bullet struck Maddox square in the chest. The man toppled backward into the dust, finally still. One threat ended, another remained. Crow flinched when Maddox fell. The split second of shock loosened his grip on Clara just enough. Sheriff Briggs stepped forward from the crowd, gun drawn. "Drop the gun, Harlan," he barked. Crow turned wild-eyed and shoved Clara aside to aim at Eli. He never got the chance. Briggs fired first. The bullet slammed into Crow's chest. He staggered, dropped his revolver, and collapsed onto the ground of the ranch he had tried to steal. Clara stumbled breathless into Eli's arms. When the final gunshot faded into the distant hills and dust settled over Iron Creek, silence rolled across the ranch, a silence thick enough to taste. It was the silence after death, after truth, after everything had changed. Harlan Crow lay dead in the dirt, Cole Maddox beside him. And the men who had followed them stood pale and shaken as Sheriff Briggs ordered them to drop their weapons. "Guns on the ground," Briggs barked. "Now." One by one, the hired guns obeyed. Some didn't meet Eli's eyes. Others looked at him with something close to shame, as if realizing too late the kind of men they'd chosen to serve. Jonah and Thomas stepped from their positions, weapons still raised until every last revolver clattered into the dust. Clara emerged from behind the well face, pale but unbroken. She clutched the unsigned deed and Crow's forged copy, one a relic of truth, the other a symbol of corruption. Sheriff Briggs motioned for her to bring them forward. "Spread 'em out," he said. Clara laid the documents on a wagon plank. Briggs called for 2 townsfolk men who could read and write well enough to recognize signatures. They bent over the papers under the glare of the noon sun. One of them adjusted his spectacles, frowning deeply. "These signatures ain't the same," he said. "Not even close," added the other. Briggs lifted the forged document and raised his voice, ensuring the entire valley and the men who once served Crow heard him clearly. "These documents are forged," he declared. "Crow's men will stand trial." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Samuel Mercer was killed for this." For the first time, the truth of Samuel's death wasn't rumor, wasn't suspicion, it was fact spoken aloud. And Eli felt something in his chest loosen, though not enough to call it relief. Not yet. Not until the valley stopped echoing with his father's ghost. Word traveled fast across the territory. By the next morning, riders delivered news to the railroad office, news that tore the foundation out from under Crow's ambitions. The telegram came in blunt and sharp. All negotiations with Harlan Crow terminated. Without Crow's influence, the investors who had circled the valley like vultures abandoned their plans. The rumors dried up. The paperwork stalled. Whatever scheme Crow had built on the backs of lies evaporated with his death. Iron Creek would not become a railroad line. Not now. Not ever. 3 days later, Eli found himself standing in the sheriff's office, and the weight of truth finally shifting toward justice. Sheriff Briggs recorded testimonies, reviewed documents, and scrawled his signature at the bottom of a temporary ownership certification. He handed the paper to Eli with a solemn nod. "Elias Mercer is lawful heir and standing owner of Iron Creek Ranch," Briggs read aloud. Jonah, standing behind Eli, gave a rare, relieved laugh and clapped Eli on the shoulder. For the first time since Eli's return, the old ranch hand's smile reached his eyes. The law had spoken. Iron Creek was Mercer land again, at least on paper. The rest would take work. The next morning dawned soft and cold. Jonah and Thomas brought a long wooden plank from the storage shed, a plank faded with sun carved with a name that once guarded the ranch like a sentry. Mercer. Eli's breath caught as he brushed dust from the grooves. The letters felt deeper than wood carved into memory, as much as grain. "It's time it went back where it belongs," Jonah said. Together, they carried the sign to the porch. They lifted it, aligned the holes to the iron hooks Samuel had hammered in decades earlier, and pressed it into place. The metal gave a loud ringing clang as it slid home. Eli closed his eyes. For a moment, it felt like his father stepped beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder the way he used to when the two of them finished a long day's work. The ranch had its name again, and the name had purpose again. That evening, as the sky burned orange over the hills, Eli saddled Claymore and rode to the ridge where the grave markers stood. In his hand, he carried Samuel Mercer's old hat, the same one his father wore the night they fought. The walk from his horse to the grave felt longer than the 3,000 miles he'd traveled to come home. He knelt before the wooden marker, tracing the carved letters with his fingertips. He swallowed hard. "I should have been here." The wind rustled through the tall grass, soft and mournful. "I'm sorry I left," Eli whispered. "I'm sorry I wasn't here." The valley held its breath, listening. "I thought running made me free," he said. "But all it did was break the things I cared about." "You were right. I didn't see it then." A tear hit the earth. "I'm here now," he said, "and I'm not running again." He placed the old hat on the grave, pressing it gently into the soil. A gesture of apology, a promise, a beginning. When he stood, he felt something unspoken pass between him and the land. Forgiveness not from his father, but from himself. That night, staring at the ranch glowing gold under lamplight, Eli realized the truth he had avoided for years. He was no longer the angry boy who rode away. He was the man who returned. He found Jonah leaning on the porch rail, watching him with calm understanding. "This ranch is mine to carry now," Eli said quietly. Jonah nodded. "Always was. Just took you a while to see it." Over the next several weeks, Iron Creek slowly shed the scars of violence. Jonah, Thomas, Clara, and even a few townsfolk who felt remorseful for once standing with Crow joined in the restoration. They rebuilt the front gate, raised fences torn down by bullets, painted the barns until they glowed like embers in the sunset. The cattle were gathered, counted, rebranded with the iconic M that Samuel Mercer had designed. The ranch breathed again, tired, battered, but alive, as if recognizing the steady hands now guiding it. Iron Creek was no longer a battlefield. It was becoming a home once more. One afternoon, railroad agent in a stiff suit rode up the valley, dust clinging to his boots, his eyes calculating as he surveyed the land. "Mr. Mercer," he called out, lifting his hat, "we're prepared to make you a generous offer for the eastern pasture. High value, immediate payment." Eli wiped sweat from his brow and glanced across the rolling grasslands. That stretch had been his mother's favorite place. It was where Samuel taught him to rope when he was 10, where Jonah broke his first horse, where Maddox's bullet missed Eli by inches just weeks earlier. "No," Eli said simply. "Iron Creek isn't for sale. Not now, not ever." The agent blinked. "Are you certain the railroad?" "I'm certain." The man left with nothing but dust behind him. Iron Creek stayed whole. As life slowly returned to normal, a quiet bond grew between Eli and Clara. She visited often, bringing food for Jonah, bandages for Thomas, or simply staying to help mend a fence or close a chicken coop. But the true moments weren't when they spoke. They were when they didn't. Some evenings, Clara sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip behind the mountains, and Eli would sit beside her without a word. She didn't press him about his past. He didn't ask her about her sorrows. They shared silence like a language only they understood, steady, unforced, patient. Their connection grew, not from declarations, but from endurance. Like grass along a creek bed, quiet, rooted, inevitable. One morning at dawn, with fog draped across the valley floor, Eli mounted Claymore and rode to the highest ridge, the place Samuel used to sit when he wanted to look over the land he loved. From the crest of the hill, Iron Creek stretched wide and golden shimmering under the rising sun. Eli inhaled deeply, the air cool and sweet. A weight he'd carried for a decade finally slid off his shoulders like a stone into deep water. He was no longer the boy who ran away in anger. No longer the son who returned too late. No longer the wanderer searching for something he couldn't name. He was the man who stayed. The man who rebuilt. The man who fought for the land that shaped him. Eli Mercer, owner of Iron Creek. Later that day, he walked back to the porch. The Mercer's sign hung slightly crooked from last night's wind. He lifted it gently and straightened it until it sat firm and proud. He stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. Every bullet fired, every truth revealed, every sacrifice made, every mile ridden. It all led here. Iron Creek Ranch stood because he chose to stand. It carried the name Mercer because he chose to carry it. And as the breeze moved across the valley, rustling the fields and whispering through the cottonwoods, Eli felt the ranch breathe with him. A legacy lost, a legacy fought for, a legacy reclaimed. Iron Creek would remain Mercer land by blood, by honor, and by the courage of the man who came home. Time moved on at Iron Creek in the quiet, steady way it does when a man finally lets himself live. Fences went up. Calves fattened. Snow came and went twice over, and the story of Harlan Crow and Cole Maddox faded into something told in low voices over whiskey, then not told much at all. Eli started to believe the valley had finally laid its ghosts to rest. Then one early autumn afternoon, he saw a rider coming from the east. The man rode slow, not like a drifter or a salesman, but like someone who already knew where he was going. His coat was long and trail-worn, his hat pulled low. A ragged old scar ran from the base of his neck across one shoulder, visible even at a distance when he dismounted without asking permission. Boots crunching on the hard-packed yard of Iron Creek. Eli stepped off the porch, hand resting near his Colt, but not drawing. "You're on private land," he said. The stranger didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and tossed something toward Eli. It was a crumpled, yellowed envelope, edges soft from years of travel. Eli caught it one-handed, smoothing the paper enough to read the jagged line scrawled across the front. "Your father owed a debt far greater than this land." The man's voice came dry and rough. "Name's Beckett," he said. "Used to ride with your pa. Long before he decided to play rancher." Eli's heartbeat stumbled. "My father didn't play anything." Beckett's eyes, pale and watchful, drifted over the ranch, the barn, the hills, the house that once belonged to Samuel Mercer. "No," he said quietly. "He didn't. That's the problem. He wouldn't say more. Not yet." They sat at the kitchen table, Clara silently setting a coffee cup in front of Beckett, her gaze measuring him the way you look at a loaded gun left on the table. Beckett wrapped scarred fingers around the cup. "You think you know who Samuel Mercer was, boy?" he asked Eli. "I know enough," Eli answered, jaw tight. "He was stubborn, hard, fair. This place was his life." Beckett gave a short, humorless laugh. That's who he became, not who he was. He leaned back. "Before this ranch, Samuel rode with a crew called the Hollow Hawks. We worked the gold routes, escorts, protection, you might say. Sometimes we escorted the wagons. Sometimes we took 'em. Depends who paid better." Clara went still by the stove. "They were outlaws," Beckett went on. "Not the dime novel kind. Real ones. Mean, smart, dangerous. Samuel was one of the best. Until the day he saw our leader put a bullet between the eyes of a man who never lifted a gun. Just a storekeeper who'd seen too much." Beckett's gaze drifted somewhere far away. "That was the day your father walked. Hollow Hawks don't like men who grow a conscience. They called him a traitor. Put a quiet price on his head. He spent years looking over his shoulder." Eli swallowed hard. His father's silences, the way he watched the horizon at night, it all shifted into new shape. "He never told me," Eli said. "That was the point," Beckett replied. "He wanted you clean of it." Later that week, while the wind rattled through the cottonwoods, Clara cleaned out the old cabin up the hill, the one Samuel had used before the main house was built. Dust lay thick over everything, a blanket on a life buried years ago. She was emptying the bottom of an old wardrobe when her fingers brushed something too smooth, too deliberate to be a fallen plank. A small panel slid back, revealing a narrow pocket. Inside was a worn leather notebook. She opened it carefully. The first pages held numbers, supply lists, trail notes. Then the tone changed. Names began to appear, men she didn't know, places she'd never heard. At the top of one page, written heavier than the rest, Hollow Hawks. She flipped through, seeing sketches of a hawk with its wings clipped, coded notes, half-finished sentences that spoke of guilt and fear. On the last written page, a symbol repeated a crude hawk, its head struck through with an X. It matched the odd mark she'd once seen on an unfinished letter Samuel had left behind. Clara closed the book slowly. Samuel Mercer hadn't been hiding from simple bad luck. He'd been preparing for something he knew might come looking. And now it had. Back in the main house, Beckett watched the fire with a hunter's patience. "Hollow Hawks is gone," he said when Eli pressed him. "At least the gang as it was. But men like that don't just vanish. Some got old, some got rich, some had sons." He turned eyes sharp. The old leader had one in particular. Mean, hungry, grew up on stories about how your father ruined everything. Those boys call themselves the Hollow Hawks Revival now. They ain't after gold. "What are they after?" Eli asked. Beckett held his stare. "They'll come for whatever Samuel took from them. And if they can't get that, they'll settle for blood." That night, Jonah found tracks on the northern ridge, fresh hoof prints circling like wolves. And there, cut into the bark of a pine overlooking the valley, a crude symbol of a hawk with its wings hacked off. The mark from a Samuel's notebook. The mark of the Hollow Hawks. Winter was coming down off the mountains. And it was bringing a storm with it. The knowledge of his father's past sat like a stone in Eli's gut. Samuel Mercer, rancher father, the man who died for Iron Creek, had once ridden with murderers robbing and killing along gold trails. The boy inside Eli rebelled against it. The man knew better. He stood by the corral one evening watching the cattle move slow as clouds. Jonah came up beside him, leaning on the fence. "You heard it all?" Eli asked. "Most," Jonah said. Heard enough? Eli exhaled, the breath sharp in the cold air. I don't know how to hold both things at once. The man Beckett talks about, and the father I remember. Jonah's gaze stayed on the horizon. What matters ain't who a man was, he said quietly. It's who he chose to become. Your pa chose this valley, chose to stand here, chose to die here. That's the man I knew. Eli nodded slowly. The past couldn't be changed, but what came next still could. If they're coming, he said at last, they won't find this place unready. The ghosts of Samuel Mercer's past were riding toward Iron Creek. Eli meant to meet them standing. The first snow dusted the hills thin and white when Jonah found the map. He was repairing a cracked beam in Samuel's old cabin, replacing rotten wood, when his hammer struck something that sounded wrong, a hollow note inside a solid beam. Curious, he pried at the seam with his knife. A narrow tube of oilcloth slid out, yellowed and hardened with age. Eli, he called, voice echoing in the cold cabin. You'd better see this. They unrolled it on the table using chipped mugs to hold the corners flat. It was a hand-drawn map, edges singed in places, as if someone had once tried to burn it and change their mind. At the top, in Samuel's precise hand, a name, Blackhorn Mountain. The lines traced the valley, the river, then farther north and west, climbing into inked slopes and jagged ridges. At the mountain's peak, a symbol had been drawn, a hawk, its wings crossed out with a bold, angry stroke. The same mark again. Beckett stared down at it, face unreadable. Damn him, he muttered. He kept it all these years, kept what Eli demanded. Beckett hesitated, then spoke as if every word cost him. The Hawks robbed a shipment once a long time back. Bigger than anything before. Gold, sure, but more than that. Papers, names, records. Turns out some respectable folks in fine clothes were standing behind some ugly deeds. He tapped the peak of Blackhorn with a scarred finger. Your father didn't take their gold. He took their ledger, a list of who paid for what. Judges, marshals, businessmen, outlaws, everybody. Why, Clara asked softly. Because with that book, Beckett said one man could burn the whole damn network to the ground, or use it to own them. And Samuel, Eli asked, which did he intend? Beckett's jaw tightened. He intended to run from it. Hide it where no one would find it. Tried to leave the fire without stoking it. So they're after the ledger, Eli said. Not land, not cattle, not even revenge. Revenge is part of it, Beckett replied. But yeah, they want their names back in the dark where they belong. Eli made the call before dawn the next morning. If that ledger's real, he said, standing in the yard with the cold air burning his lungs, it's not just our problem. It's law. It's power. It's every small town between here and the railroad. So you're going after it, Jonah said. Eli nodded. If we bring it down, they've got nothing left to chase. Clara crossed her arms against the chill. Then I'm coming with you. Eli frowned. No, it's too dangerous. She looked him dead in the eye. You'll need someone who can read Samuel's code. That notebook wasn't written for men who think with bullets. Beckett chuckled under his breath. She's got you there. Eli knew she was right. The map, the symbols, the half-finished notes, they were Samuel's way of speaking across time. And Clara had already begun to understand his turns of phrase better than anyone. Fine, Eli said. You come. Jonah, you stay and watch Iron Creek. Like hell I will. Jonah replied. I'll keep the place ready. But I ain't letting you ride into the mountains with just a stranger and a notebook. Thomas'll stay with the sheriff. I'll ride halfway and wait for word. In the end, the compromise was this: Eli, Clara, and Beckett would go on ahead. Jonah would follow a half day behind, bringing extra supplies and a watchful eye. Blackhorn Mountain waited 2 days' hard ride to the north. They saddled up and turned their horses toward it. The trail into the high country was a lesson in how small a person could feel. The land rose around them in steep, pine-clad walls. Snow deepened with each mile. Loose rock shifted under hooves, occasionally skittering into ravines that fell away into white nothing. A sudden landslide forced them to take shelter in a narrow notch as stone and ice thundered down the slope, filling the air with dust that turned the world gray. When it cleared, the path behind them was gone buried. "We'll have to cut east and circle," Beckett said. "Adds half a day." That night, the three of them shared the cramped hollow of a cave, a small fire fighting back the cold. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. Clara's hands shook slightly as she held her tin cup of coffee. Eli noticed and moved closer, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "You don't have to prove anything," he murmured. She glanced at him, eyes reflecting firelight. "I'm not here to prove anything," she said. "I'm here because if your father put this in code, he wanted someone to read it right. And because this valley's my home too now, whether I like it or not." He smiled faintly. "Do you some days?" she said, leaning into his warmth. "More lately than not." Beckett turned his gaze away, giving them privacy in the thin way a man who'd lived too long among killers knew how. They reached the upper meadow below Blackhorn's Peak on the third day. The map guided them to a narrow shelf of rock where an ancient, storm-battered lean-to clung to the mountainside like a stubborn memory. Inside, beneath a layer of snow and pine needles, they found what Samuel had left behind. Beckett unearthed a metal box rusted around the hinges, but still intact. Eli pried it open with his knife. Inside lay a water-warped but legible ledger book pages, dense with names and transactions. Clara flipped through it, breath shallow. 27 names under one mark, she whispered, pointing. That symbol again. The hawk. "Those are the core hawks," Beckett said quietly. "And these," he tapped another page, "are the men in suits who pretended their hands were clean." Beneath the ledger was a folded sheet of paper stained with age. Eli recognized the handwriting even before he unfolded it. "Eli, if you find this, it means the past has returned for you as it did for me." His throat tightened as he read. The letter spoke of choices of fear, of the weight of knowing too much. Samuel had written of his shame, his hope that Eli might never have to carry the same burden. He'd never finished the letter. The last line ended mid-sentence. A shout echoed faintly up the mountain. Beckett moved to the edge of the ledge and peered down. Riders, at least a dozen, were snaking their way up the lower switchbacks, dark figures against the snow. "Hawks," Beckett said. "They found us." Eli closed the ledger and slipped it into his coat. "Then we take what my father started," he said, voice steady, "and finish it the way he couldn't. The mountain had given up its secret. Now they had to get it back down alive." They pushed their horses hard down the opposite side of Blackhorn, riding a narrow game trail that Beckett swore would bring them out closer to Iron Creek. Snow turned to sleet, then to cold rain as they lost altitude. By the time the valley came into view, the peaceful sight Eli expected was replaced with something far worse. A column of black smoke rose from the southern edge of Iron Creek. Eli's heart slammed against his ribs. "Ride," he snapped, digging his heels into Claymore's sides. They reached the outskirts of the ranch to find a section of the south barn charred and half collapsed. Cattle bellowed nervously. Bullet scars pocked the fence posts. Sheriff Briggs sat on the porch steps, shoulder-bandaged face gray with pain. Thomas stumbled out of the house, bruised but alive. They hit us yesterday, Thomas said, breathless. Called themselves Hawks. Came in hard. Burned a corner of the barn, took a few head of cattle, but mostly they were sending a message. Where were you? Eli demanded, helping Briggs to his feet. Out on patrol with 2 men, Briggs grunted. They ambushed us. I'm lucky to be upright. He gripped Eli's arm. They're not just after you anymore, son. They want everyone who stands with Mercer to kneel. Eli looked around at the damage, then up at the hills where he knew those men hid in the timber watching. I fought once for my father's land, he said, voice low but clear. I'll fight again for everyone who calls this valley home. That night, Iron Creek became a fortress. Eli and Jonah, who had arrived just hours after them from his halfway camp, climbed onto the barn roof, picking spots for sharpshooters. Thomas and a couple of town volunteers stacked lumber and fence rails into rough barricades at choke points along the main road. We'll light signal fires on the ridge, Jonah said. If it goes bad, folks in town will see. Clara moved among the wounded, redressing Briggs's bandage, checking Thomas's ribs. In the brief lulls, she sat at the table with Samuel's coded notebook and the ledger from Blackhorn, looking for anything. Names, patterns, weaknesses they could use. Anything Eli asked, stopping at her shoulder. She tapped a page. This symbol she circled a small mark beside 3 names means they were paid to come from outside, not local. If we cut off their route in and out, we trap them. Eli nodded. Then we make sure they ride into a box. Beckett lingered at the edge of the lamplight, cleaning his gun with methodical care. His face was calm, but his eyes were harder than Eli had ever seen. They'll come at dawn, Beckett said. Hawks like to hit when a man thinks he can see everything. He was right. First light spilled over the ridge, and with it came the enemy. They flowed down from the timberline like dark water riders, fanning out in 3 directions. One group moved along the rocky flank above the house. Another slipped through the trees at the valley's edge. A third line rode bold and straight up the main road, dust and steam rising from their horses in the cold. Positions, Eli shouted. Jonah's Spencer cracked from the barn roof, dropping the lead rider on the left flank. Thomas opened up from behind the well, his shotgun roaring, scattering the front line and forcing them to break formation. From the tree line, return fire spat splinters from the corral and tore chunks from the porch rail. The air filled with a stinging stink of powder. Beckett moved where the fighting was thickest, his gun work fast and brutal, each shot placed with the certainty of a man who'd lived too long by his aim. The Hawks' leader rode in the main line, a tall man with cold eyes and a hawk emblem burned into the leather of his vest. He steered his horse with one hand, firing with the other, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. At the fence, he snarled, "Break it, burn it. Leave nothing standing that says Mercer." Eli recognized something in his face, a resemblance to the old story Beckett had told. This was the son of the original leader, the boy raised on tales of betrayal. They clashed at the edge of the front pasture horses, sliding in the churned mud as bullets hissed past. The leader leveled his gun at Eli and shouted above the din. "Your father stole our legacy." Beckett ducked behind a hay wagon, shouted back, rage sharpening his words. He saved a child you were going to kill. That was his real crime. For an instant, the battlefield froze around that revelation. The leader swung his gaze toward Beckett, hatred burning bright. "You," he hissed. "You were the brat he stole from us." Pieces fell into place for Eli the way Beckett had spoken about Samuel, the strange loyalty and his bitterness. Samuel Mercer hadn't just left the Hawks. He'd stolen their future heir and raised him elsewhere. Or at least tried to. Beckett stepped out from cover gun in hand. "He chose you," he told Eli over the leader's shoulder. "Not them. Remember that?" The leader spurred his horse, charging the yard, and the world snapped back into motion. The fight spilled up onto the lower slopes of the mountain behind the ranch as the hawks tried to circle and flank. Eli found himself chasing the leader up a snowy incline, boots slipping, breath burning in his chest. They broke free of the trees onto a narrow ridge, the valley yawning below. "Just you and me now," Mercer, the leader, called, turning with a predatory grin. "No sheriff. No old man with a badge to save you this time." Eli drew his Colt, thumbed back the hammer. "I don't need saving." They circled each other on the icy rock, every step a risk. Snowflakes began to fall, slow and quiet, indifferent to the violence unfolding between them. The leader fired first. Eli threw himself sideways, the bullet whining past his ear. He returned fire, grazing the man's shoulder. The leader hissed, anger replacing caution. He rushed forward, trying to close the distance, to turn the gunfight into a grapple where gravity might do his work. Eli held his ground. He remembered his father's teachings: never rush, never flinch, never let anger aim your hand. The leader lunged. Eli stepped inside the motion, slammed his forearm into the man's gun wrist, and fired point blank. The shot echoed off the stone, rolling down into the valley. The leader staggered, eyes wide with disbelief, then toppled backward. His body slid down the snowy slope, disappearing into the trees below. On the ranch floor, the remaining hawks saw their leader fall. Panic spread through their ranks. Some dropped their guns and ran. Others spurred their horses hard and scattered into the hills. Sheriff Briggs, pale and sweating from pain, pushed himself out onto the porch with his revolver still in his good hand. "Drop 'em!" he shouted at the nearest fleeing riders. Between his shots and Jonah's, a handful of hawks hit the dirt alive and unhappy wrists, bound within minutes. The rest vanished into the wild country, leaderless and broken. The battle for Iron Creek was over. Again. A week later, a small detachment of federal officers arrived in Red Hollow. Eli, Clara, and Briggs met them at the sheriff's office, where the ledger from Blackhorn Mountain lay on the desk like a sleeping snake. "This is bigger than just your valley," the ranking officer said after reading a few pages. "These names, some of these men have been ghosts to us for years." "Then you can use it," Eli answered. "Because I'm finished hiding it." The ledger and the coded notebook were taken into federal custody, sealed and signed for. Somewhere far from the quiet hills of Iron Creek, the last remnants of the Hollow Hawks would be hunted down and brought into the light. A dark chapter that had begun long before Eli was born finally found its end. That evening, Eli sat alone at Samuel's old desk. In his hands, he held the completed letter he'd found in the mountain box, a second page folded behind the first that he'd missed in the chaos. "If the darkness finds you," Samuel had written in a shaky hand, "let the light be something you make yourself. Don't run like I did. Stand." Eli read it 3 times. Then he set it down gently and blew out a long breath. "I'm standing, Pa," he said into the quiet room. "I won't hide the things you hid. I won't run from what you ran from." He wasn't Samuel Mercer, and he wasn't bound to repeat Samuel's mistakes. He could carry the name without carrying the shame. Beckett left at dawn 2 days later. He saddled his horse without ceremony. Eli walked out to meet him. "You could stay," Eli said. "Work here. Iron Creek has room." Beckett shook his head. "I'm tied too close to what you just cut loose. Some men in this world used to fear the Hawks. Now they'll fear whoever brought them down. They may come looking for you, or for anyone who rode beside you." He adjusted his saddle, then added, "You're stronger than he was, your pa. Stronger in the right ways. Don't waste that." Eli offered his hand. Beckett took it, grip firm, and then turned his horse toward the rising sun. Clara joined Eli at the fence as Beckett's silhouette grew smaller. She slid her hand into his fingers, lacing naturally, no questions asked. So she said, What now? Eli looked out over Iron Creek. The fences, the cattle, the house, with the Mercer's sign straight and true. Beyond it, the mountains watched in their ancient silence. Now he said, "We ranch, we live, we make this place something better than what it was built on." Clara squeezed his hand. Sounds like a good start. Iron Creek had been many things: sanctuary, battleground, inheritance, burden. Now at last, it was something else. Home. Thank you for riding through this story with me. If Eli's journey, his battles, and his search for redemption moved you even a little, I'd be honored to have you stay for the next chapter. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next on this trail.